Zero is arguably the ultimate villain of Metal Gear Solid because he's the shadowy puppet master who pulls the strings of social control that lock the world in an endlessly escalating military crisis. In the 1970s, Zero created a secret governing apparatus called Cipher, which sought to control the flow of all information and weapons everywhere. And he later invested this apparatus with an artificial intelligence called the Patriots, and he released it into the world to autonomously direct the fate of all human history in accordance with its own interpretation of Zero's will. And the result was a global tyranny of violence. But this is where things get kind of funny, because Zero's will as the founder of Cipher and template for the Patriots' intelligence was itself an interpretation of another legendary hero and indeed his personal friend. Here, of course, I'm speaking of the Boss, who was the mentor of Naked Snake, aka Big Boss. The Boss was a soldier who dreamed of a world in which all military conflicts could be resolved, for she believed that war itself was the product of an illusion that she sought to overcome. And this illusion is called the nation-state. The Boss understood that the nation is a flimsy social construction created by boundaries artificially drawn in the sand and enforced not by justice, but by violence alone. And it derives its power from the fictional idea of a unified people that lives within those boundaries. And in the Boss's day, this fiction gave rise to such artificial notions as Americans and Soviets, each with their own distinct national character that transcends all other socioeconomic categories. And these artificial notions, in turn, gave rise to the Cold War, which placed Americans and Soviets in an ideological relation of eternal hostility, as enemies unto death. But the Boss understood that the Cold War wasn't really a conflict between Americans and Soviets. It was really just a conflict between two tiny factions of governing elites that each wanted to control the world. They wanted to control the world in the way that they control the people within their nations, and thus they enlisted those same peoples to wage war on their behalf by appealing to the illusion of national identity and culture and patriotism and loyalty to one's country. These were the ideas that produced the soldiers of national armies, and which could pit those soldiers against one another as American capitalist and Soviet communist. But the Boss dreamed of a different world in which those ideas would melt away, and so too would the wars to which they gave rise. This was a world beyond nations and their divisive games of power, where soldiers like herself were no longer enlisted to kill and be killed by an illusory enemy, because there would no longer be any country to fight for. But the Boss also lacked the power to make this world a reality. The nation-state was too strong. It exercised too much control to even imagine a world in which it no longer exists. The best she could do was simply to reveal the truth about the state of affairs to her fellow soldiers, as indeed she revealed it to her protege Naked Snake. And thus she sent him on a path of deconstruction wherein he could escape the snares of patriotism and national identity, which held him captive to the American war machine. That path ultimately led him to defect from America and found his own society, which was an order of soldiers who belonged to no nation, and thus who could not be held in thrall to any national ideology. And in truth, all of this is the context in which we also need to understand Zero's role as the villain of Metal Gear Solid. Because Zero was once a trusted colleague both of the Boss and of Naked Snake. They all conducted operations together as comrades in the 1960s. And Zero likewise understood the Boss's insight into the illusion of nations. And after she died, he shared her dream of overcoming the fractured world that this illusion created. That was the reason why he created the governing apparatus of Cipher and the Patriots, and why he used them to amass control of all information and weapons everywhere. The point of this organization was to take control of the world away from nations, just as the Boss had dreamed. But in the end, Zero would never actually achieve the Boss's dream. Instead, he created more of a nightmarish shadow of this dream. His organization did achieve total control of the world by the time of Metal Gear Solid 4, but total control is not an easy thing to achieve. It requires violence and coercion and fictions of domination that are just as potent as any promulgated by the nation-state. And all of these evils inevitably corrupt the one who deploys them. And so it was that Zero's quest for total control plunged the world into tyranny. Zero would ultimately become an agent and symbol of violent domination that was worse than anything the Boss had ever wished to destroy, because now there were no nations to oppose him.